So the Reverend Dr. James Cone, great scholar of our time, he says the cross was God's critique of power, which is a beautiful way to understand an ugly event. In Jesus' case, directly, the cross is a critique of the Roman Empire's power as they stomped out not just the Palestinian and Jewish nation there, but they stomped out minority populations around the world. They loved their power. But we don't have Romans anymore, and we don't have crosses in the same way as they had. So eternally, in all places, all times, this cross, it's a wide symbol, a critique against any and all destructive, abusive power. God's power lifts up, and Roman cross power suffocates. Dr. Cone also says, in this book right here, he says that the crucifixion was clearly a first-century lynching. Now, our modern racial landscape does not map at all to first-century Mediterranean culture, but he makes a fine point that Jesus died on a wooden lynching tree. Importantly, Cone does not say that there is redemption in the suffering itself of the cross. Rather, any redemption for any of us, any salvation for any of us, any liberation, any new life comes in response to any of the suffering that we experience. Now, some white evangelicals and some Catholics like Mel Gibson or our hillbilly hypocrite, J.D. Vance, who the Pope, by the way, the Pope responded to him. And the Pope said, "Sir, you know nothing about Catholic theology or Christian compassion. When the Pope drops the mic on you, normally you just kind of shut up. But, that's not what's happening here." Instead, some folks seem to think, they seem to enjoy this idea that God uses pain as punishment. They seem to appreciate the idea that blood somehow can do something magic. People who are more aligned with causing suffering sure seem to miss God's point about overcoming suffering. Now, for anyone who has experienced systematic violence, for any of us who care about people who have experienced violence, if that suffering has any value, if the cross matters at all, it's because God responds. How does God respond to a cross? With resurrection. From pain to new life. God's power is new life in all things, in all ways, in all times. Now, you could imagine, it might be a better symbol in our life if we had an empty tomb here. It might show you more quickly that there's like resurrection power coming all the time. That'd be a great symbol. But early Protestants, instead, they chose a cross. They were choosing this separate from a cross with Jesus hanging on it. Some of you grew up with a cross with Jesus. Some of you grew up with one unleaded, like this. And their idea is that Jesus is off the cross, that God's love is in perfect opposition to any oppression, to any abuse, to any revenge, to any cruelty, to any cultivated ignorance around one's prejudice. So, the lynching of Emmett Till is a critique of God's power in a local way, much like the crucifixion is a critique of God's love in an eternal sense. And the murder of Eric Garner is a scandal to God's love in a local sense. The murders of Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Philando Castile, Breonna Taylor, Elijah McClain, the excuses around George Floyd's murder, that little demon Kyle Rittenhouse, all those very present, very modern lynchings are their own bloodied cross. And just like with Jesus, those horrors, they call on God to respond with new life. And they call on us to respond with lament, solidarity, and transformation of our hearts and of the world. In the Good Friday story, you've heard it, Pat read it, this is Emmanuel's first time as a liturgist, but you've heard that story a whole bunch of times. Kind of a rough story for Emmanuel's first liturgy, Yeah. You know that you hear that story and your mind goes right to kind of Easter things and the story you've heard there, but what you may have missed, because people get so nervous around politics in church. People are so scared that this will make someone uncomfortable. Don't say anything controversial, Hansen, on Sunday morning. You might offend someone. Oh, to hell with that. Because in this story, what did we say? What was in that parenthetical about every other line? We have a governor, a head of state, We have a military that's just stuck in corruption. We have a special interest group that is just rabid for disinformation. All those parties are just so clearly more concerned with power than with peace. They're more concerned with getting their way than with any righteousness. We have a legal system being coerced, and we have a victim, in this case 3 victims in this version of the story, just caught up in this farce. And they would not be forgotten, because victims are not forgotten in God's justice. It would not be forgotten because history repeats itself. And we too face corrupt leaders, weaponized law enforcement, an epidemic of addiction to lies, a campaign of power that runs straight over our courts, and we have a lot of victims. More every day. Some of you are knowing them too close. The destruction of what is lamented as DEI, that's a lynching. Hatred against trans folks, a lynching. The assault on women's safety and dignity is a lynching. The trashing of the environment is a lynching. The scapegoating and hunting of migrants is a lynching. It's a lynching spree right now, and I hope to God it will maintain being metaphorical, although I doubt it. Our country's leadership right now seems to only know the power of putting people on the cross, while folks like us pray for God to respond by lifting them off. And folks like us wonder how best to respond with solidarity, with transformation of our hearts and the world. There is space between the awful realities of the crucifixion and the redemptive hope of resurrection. And that space begins right where Pat's reading was ending. Because in this story, standing near the cross, were friends and family of Jesus, 3 women and the apostle that Jesus loved, who's traditionally named John. Before the cross finishes its bloody work, we see a new emphasis on relationships that cross boundaries. They're kind of unusual because John is a young man. These disciples, I remind you every time we lean into this, but these disciples started out as 16 and 17-year-old boys. So let's say John was 20 years old, and now he's being connected to this middle-aged woman, middle-aged widow. Or the connection between Mother Mary, a poor rural woman, and she's befriended by Mary Magdalene, a wealthy urban widow. They never would have had opportunities in those worlds to become friends until Jesus shows up. Even at the point of death, God makes space for new living, for new ways of seeing the world. Even in death, God is pointing always to liberation from the abuses of power to the hope of transformation. So whenever it is you see the figure of a cross, don't forget about these witnesses, these people standing there who God used to begin the process of resurrecting a better world. Which raises the question, as we witness the lynching of America and the crucifixion of people who terrify the corrupt pilots of our day, where are our seeds of hope? Who are we standing beside in solidarity? Where is the space for new living? Where is there inspiration for fresh vision? Where can new relationships, the kind of relationships that cross boundaries, where can they lift up change? How can we soothe our grief and reconnect with grace? How can we set down our anger and try to live in peace? How can we take steps to strengthen our souls for the long work of resurrection? The answer, very easy, I don't know. I wish I knew. I have ideas, but I don't have answers for how to be a witness to the cross and to resurrection. I think you have ideas also. And part of the step is listening to each other's ideas as we walk into this new reality. So here's my best idea. I'm going to kind of close on this. It's a small part of a story that I've told here before, but it fits really nicely with our time. Mary Magdalene, who is at the cross. She's the first witness to resurrection morning. Every Easter, we read the story where it's Mary Magdalene who shows up and finds that. She's typically associated with the city Magdala. Okay, have you been to Magdala? You don't think you have? Okay, it's called Migdala, and it's just a couple miles down because they had to rebuild the city. So Magdala was a city back then. It's a place marker for her name. It's like, this is Mary from Magdala. It'd be like if I was Hansen Mill Creek, or if that was like Sylvia South Jordan, or Sandy. That's kind of a weird one. But yeah, Sandy. So Magdala in the first century, it was a well-to-do Jewish city on the southwest banks of the Sea of Galilee. They had a really strong industry in drying fish. It's just, different towns get good at different things, and that was brought in a lot of money for that. Our best guess is that Mary was a wealthy widow from that town, and that Jesus, in sailing across that lake, met her basically at a widow's support group. In the years after Jesus was crucified, obviously the church continued its message, not just in Israel, Palestine, but all over the whole Mediterranean. The Christian way just grew in so many places. And often that meant conflict with Roman authorities, because Roman authorities had conflict with everybody who was different from them. So, for instance, 17 years after Jesus was crucified, the resistance kept going, and at 17 years, there was this really big riot, and a bunch of Jews were surrounded by soldiers, and the Jews kind of begged for dignity by sticking their necks out and saying, just cut off our heads if you're going to treat us this way. That's where we get the phrase, stick your neck out. They were trying to show the importance of liberation and mercy to a government. And the soldiers did let them go, but the government put yet another pile of restrictions and taxes and punishment on the already hurting people. Another 17 years later, so we're in 67 CE, a new, particularly harsh emperor had come to power in Rome. His name was Nero. Some of you have heard of Nero. Really bad dude, one of the worst dudes in history. He executed a bunch more Jews and Christians. He had more crosses than anyone had ever seen. And here's where the story gets interesting to me. In 67 CE, in this total imbalance of just Roman rage and so many of these minority populations just suffering, he sent a general to destroy the city of Magdala. And they just knocked it to the ground. They killed some, they sent most of them away and said, you have to live somewhere else. You need to live over, go north, go south, go anywhere. And they took that town and they turned it into a resort for wealthy Romans. And that's the history. This is the history that happened in 67, the year before the Gospel of Mark basically was published, was finally written down and sent out. Almost like it was Magdala that demanded a response. And then 3 years later, a new emperor, new destruction, the Romans come to Jerusalem and they knock the temple down. Some of you have been to the temple and you see there's one wall remaining, the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall. That's from that temple. But in 70 AD, 70 CE, that's when they knocked it down. And within a couple years, Matthew and Luke were published. Right after that. Almost like people needed a story of resurrection when they saw destruction. So Mary from Magdala, she does not show up in any of Paul's letters that were written in the 30s and 40s. She does not show up in any of the other New Testament books that were written in the 50s and 60s. She only shows up after the city Magdala is destroyed. And her role in the Gospels, always, in all the Gospels, she is the witness at the cross and she is the witness at the resurrection. She is named for a place destroyed out of vengeance and greed, and she is the main thread to new life. And if history does not repeat itself, it certainly rhymes. And God has shown throughout the Bible that rhymes around love and liberation are the Spirit's favorite song. So, despite what we're seeing in news today, it would not surprise me at all to find someday in the not-so-distant future that God's instrument for peace, it's not going to be the next president, y'all. It's not. It's not going to be some, strong white guy with an Ivy League background, military career. No, it's not going to be it. It's not going to be someone from Wall Street who has great ideas. Nope. If God is already cooking up a recipe for redemption, it will almost certainly be led by a woman of color, maybe from Gaza, someone who lost everything except her faith. And I'm not giving you fortune telling. I'm telling you, this is how God works. That some woman who has already gone through so much in her life, so much personal loss, and now is the victim of another mass lynching, this is how God works, to inspire her to show us the way. It might not be Gaza, even though that works so perfect, lines up with Magdala becoming a resort. It might be a woman whose country was ravaged by strip mines in Africa. It might be a woman from the slums of India. It might be someone who escaped Ukraine. It might be a woman whose parents brought her from Southeast Asia to the Pacific Northwest, and now she knows 2 cultures she can walk through. But however it happens, God is a God of new life. And God always sends those who are outside the circles of power to show the way. So pay attention to what bubbles up. Pay attention to the healers around us. Pay attention to the breath in your life and the spirit around the world. Pay attention to how we move past that lynching tree. And I pray that you see God's plan unfold. May it be.